We told you in October about a research project funded by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board targeted at learning more about the use of cover crops in this state. That work was being conducted at 4 UNL locations across Nebraska, but there are also several producers in the state looking to study cover crops through trials in the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network. As Nebraska Extension educator Rees said when we recently talked with her on campus, using cover crops may not always be about increasing yields, but about improving specific aspects of a producer's operation.
There's a lot of different reasons why farmers are interested in cover crops, and what I would suggest first is it's based on what their goal is for cover crops. So some farmers are interested in grazing, some are interested in increasing nitrogen in their fields, so they'd plant a legume. Some are interested in taking up nitrogen, so such as after seed corn. Some are interested in having some natural tillage with some of the different cover crops. So there's a lot of different reasons for cover crops.
Tell me about some of the research that you're doing with farmers in the state to look at cover crops and the potential benefits.
Okay, so last year in 2014, we had farmers in 5 different locations of the state: Phelps County, Franklin, Clay, Seward, and Saunders County, and they were all doing cover crops for the first time, and they were looking at if cover crop, what they did is they had a study where they were looking at the cover crop versus the previous year's residue. And then all of the cover crops were winter killed in these situations, and then they were looking at what the yield of the successive crop was, and if that yield was different where the cover crop was planted versus where they just had the residue.
What did they find in those situations?
Okay, so in these situations, all these farmers were in no-till, and they were all in their first year of planting those cover crops. And in all the situations, they also found that the cover crop didn't yield as much where the cover crop was planted. That successive crop, whether it was corn or wheat, didn't yield as much as what the place where the
previous year? Mm-hmm. And why is that, do you think?
Why that is? Well, it could be a number of reasons. It could be rainfall. We had a huge rainfall distribution, even though last year we look at 2014 as being a pretty wet year. It could have also been impacts from the previous years when the cover crop was planted. There could have been less rainfall in some of those locations of the state. There's also research out there that suggests the first year that cover crops are planted doesn't necessarily produce a yield increase in the second year crop. So it's important to go back to why these producers were planting these different cover crops. Some of them were just an individual species, some were a mix. Some of them were doing this for a grazing impact. Some of them were doing it just to look, maybe down the road, look at organic matter increases, and they would measure that with their soil tests.
How many of those farmers are going to continue this study?
We're hoping that all of them will continue the study. From our on-farm research updates last year, it sounds like most of them were willing to try it a second year and just see if there would be what the results were.
So we've talked about on-farm research and specifically the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network before on Market Journal. But for a project like this, how time intensive is it if a producer wanted to do something like this on his or her operation?
Well, when it comes to cover crops, you need to be planning a good year out in some cases, or at least be thinking about it now if you're thinking about planting cover crops. What may be better options for establishment would be after, if you had wheat and you harvest wheat, you could go in with a cover crop mix then and have some good establishment, or if you have to take silage off. Those are some good situations for cover crops this coming year, where you could then go in with another crop next year and look at those differences.
More information about the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network can be found on the CropWatch website. We'll also link to those materials on the Market Journal homepage. The network is sponsored by Nebraska Extension, the Nebraska Corn Growers Association, the Nebraska Corn Board, and the Nebraska Soybean Board.